before the world reacts, before headlines spread across news feeds, before opinions begin to form. There's always a quieter moment that happens first. A moment of transition. A shift that does not announce itself loudly, but changes everything in the background of history. And in this case, it begins with a name the world has known for decades. Queen Elizabeth II, a figure whose presence shaped an entire era of the monarchy, and whose influence extended far beyond the walls of palaces and estates. But history does not pause. It continues forward. And as time moves, so does responsibility. Now, attention turns toward Prince William, a man who has lived much of his life under global observation, but now finds himself closer than ever to the weight of legacy, tradition, and leadership within the royal structure. Because behind palace doors, beyond public ceremonies, and outside the image the world sees, there are estates, properties, and private royal assets that carry not just financial value, but historical and symbolic importance. And one of those estates, long associated with the Queen's personal holdings, has now become part of a new chapter. Not a dramatic takeover, not a sudden shift, but a structured transition that reflects how monarchies evolve quietly over time, rather than in moments of chaos. Still, even quiet transitions carry meaning, and meaning is what the world is now trying to understand. What does it represent when responsibility linked to the Queen's private estate begins to move into the hands of the next generation? What changes behind the scenes, and what remains the same? To understand this, you have to look beyond the surface, because royal estates are not just land or property. They are long-standing systems of history, management, tradition, and continuity. They are maintained across generations, often in ways the public never fully sees. And within that structure, every change, no matter how administrative it may appear, represents something deeper. A passing of stewardship, a continuation of legacy, a reminder that monarchy is not static. It evolves, slowly, carefully, and with intention. Prince William's position within the royal family has been building toward responsibility for years. From public duties to charitable leadership, from representing the crown internationally to preparing for future roles within the institution. Each step has been part of a larger progression, not rushed, not accidental, but structured. And now, attention naturally focuses on what this estate transition symbolizes within that progression, because when the public hears phrases like control or ownership, perception often jumps to power. But within royal systems, these terms are far more procedural than dramatic. They represent management, oversight, and continuity of legacy assets that have been maintained across centuries. Still, perception matters, and perception is what drives global interest. That is why this moment has drawn attention far beyond traditional royal coverage, because it sits at the intersection of history and transition, past and future, memory and responsibility. And while the details may be administrative, the symbolism is what captures public imagination. What does it mean when the next generation begins to take on structures once associated so closely with the Queen? What remains unchanged? And what slowly begins to evolve? These are not questions with immediate answers, because royal institutions do not shift in visible waves. They move in layers, through planning, through protocol, through carefully managed continuity. And that is why most changes remain subtle to the public eye. But internally, they represent ongoing evolution. As Prince William continues to take on more responsibilities within the royal framework, each step becomes part of a long-term structure designed to ensure stability, not disruption, not reinvention, but continuation. And in that continuation lies the true nature of monarchy. It is not defined by sudden change. It is defined by endurance, by adaptation without collapse, by evolution without interruption. And yet, even within that structure, moments like this still carry emotional weight, because they remind the world of transition itself, that no role remains frozen forever, that responsibility moves forward with time, and that history is always being rewritten quietly in the background. As the narrative unfolds, public interest will continue to grow. Some will interpret it as symbolic power shift. Others will see it as routine administration, but the reality sits somewhere in between. It is both structure and symbolism, both procedure and perception, and that duality is what makes royal transitions so compelling to the public, because they exist in a space where history is still alive. and decisions made today are part of a chain that stretches backward for generations. In that sense, the estate is not just property. It is continuity, a physical representation of legacy being passed forward. And as that responsibility begins to align more closely with Prince William, the broader picture becomes clearer. This is not about sudden change. It is about gradual preparation, a continuation of roles that ensure stability within one of the oldest institutions in the world. And while the world outside may focus on headlines, speculation, or simplified narratives, inside the structure itself, the focus remains on continuity, on preservation, on maintaining the balance between tradition and the future, because that is the core of monarchy. Not speed, not disruption, but endurance across time. As this chapter continues to develop quietly behind palace walls, the meaning will become clearer not in one moment, but over time, through actions, through responsibilities, through the gradual shaping of the next era. And in the end, what appears as a single transition is actually part of something much larger, a long unfolding story of legacy, duty, and continuity. And as one chapter settles into the next, history continues forward, quietly, steadily, without stopping, and always watching the future take its place within the past. And yet, what makes this moment so closely followed is not only the structure behind it, but what it represents in the public imagination. Because whenever a name like Prince William is connected to responsibility of this scale, the world does not just hear administration. It hears transition. It hears the beginning of a new era slowly forming under the surface of tradition. But inside royal institutions, change is never announced the way the public expects. There are no sudden declarations in the way people imagine, no dramatic shifts in tone or structure. Instead, everything happens through careful layers of planning, legal structure, and historical continuity. Because the royal system is not built like modern organizations. It is built like an inheritance of centuries. Every estate, every responsibility, every managed property exists within a framework designed to survive time itself. And that is why even something that appears simple on the surface can carry deeper meaning beneath it. The Queen's private estate, long associated with personal oversight and historical continuity, is not just land or property in the ordinary sense. It is part of a system that blends tradition, administration, and symbolic legacy. And when responsibility connected to something like this begins to shift, even slightly, it becomes a signal, not of disruption, but of progression. Because within monarchy, progression is never rushed. It is prepared, sometimes over years, sometimes over decades. From an outside perspective, it may look like a single decision, but internally, it is a result of long-term planning that aligns with succession, duty distribution, and institutional continuity. And that is where the real story exists, not in speculation, but in structure, because structures like this are designed to remain stable regardless of public attention. They are built to carry weight across generations without breaking. And that stability is what allows transitions like this to happen without visible disruption. Still, perception is powerful, and perception is what turns administrative movement into global conversation. Because people do not just follow monarchy as a system. They follow it as a story, a living narrative that connects history, identity, and continuity in a way few other institutions do. And within that narrative, every shift becomes meaningful. Every responsibility becomes symbolic. Every transition becomes part of a larger emotional timeline. That is why attention naturally focuses on Prince William. Not because of sudden change, but because of positioning. Because over time, his role within the royal family has gradually expanded. From public duties to international representation, from charitable leadership to institutional presence, each stage has been part of a long preparation process that extends far beyond public visibility. And now, as responsibility linked to historic estate structures becomes part of that journey, it fits into a larger pattern. A pattern of gradual transition, not transformation, but continuity. And continuity is what defines monarchy more than anything else. Because monarchies do not function through disruption. They function through succession, through carefully managed transfer of roles that ensure stability remains intact even as individuals change. That is why moments like this are rarely about immediate impact. They are about long-term positioning, about ensuring that responsibility is never left in uncertainty. and that legacy is always preserved through structured transition. But even with that structure in place, the emotional layer remains unavoidable, because for the public, the connection is not just institutional. It is personal. It is tied to memory, to history, to the presence of Queen Elizabeth II, whose era shaped how the modern monarchy is understood today. And whenever something associated with that era begins to move forward into the next generation, it naturally creates reflection, not necessarily about change itself, but about time, because time is the only force that even the most stable institutions cannot resist. And as time moves forward, responsibility moves with it, quietly, systematically, without interruption. From within the royal structure, this is not seen as an ending. It is seen as continuation, a handover of responsibility designed to maintain stability across generations. And that is why the system exists in this form, to ensure that even as individuals change, the institution remains consistent. But from the outside, it always feels like a moment of shift, because the public sees people, not systems. They see faces, not frameworks. And that difference is what creates global attention. As discussions continue and interpretations spread, the truth remains more grounded in speculation. This is not a sudden transformation. It is not a break from tradition. It is tradition itself functioning as intended, slowly, deliberately, continuously. And as Prince William's responsibilities expand within that structure, it reflects a broader reality of monarchy. That leadership is not introduced. It is developed, not announced in moments, but built over time. And as this chapter continues to unfold quietly behind palace walls, it will not be defined by a single headline, but by a series of steady, structured steps that carry history forward without interruption. Because in the end, monarchy is not shaped by moments of change. It is shaped by the ability to endure them. And as one era gradually transitions into the next, the story does not end. It simply continues, in a different form, with the same foundation, and a future still being written. But beyond structure and tradition, there is something deeper the public always feels during moments like this. A sense of transition, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady and inevitable. Because when responsibility linked to historic royal estates begins to align with a new generation, it naturally draws attention to what is changing behind the scenes, and what is remaining the same. Within the royal system, estates and private holdings are not just assets. They are part of a long-standing framework designed to preserve continuity across generations. Nothing moves without structure. Nothing shifts without planning. And nothing changes without purpose. That is why even a single adjustment in responsibility carries meaning far beyond its technical details. It represents trust. It represents preparation. And it represents the gradual shaping of the future. For Prince William, this moment fits into a much longer path that has been forming for years. A path built on public duty, institutional experience, and gradual expansion of responsibility within the monarchy. Not rushed, not unexpected, but carefully developed over time. And while the public may interpret these changes in many different ways, inside the system, it is understood differently, as continuity, as progression, as part of a structure designed to remain stable, even as roles evolve. Because monarchy does not move through disruption. It moves through succession, quietly, steadily, and always forward.